I was 28 years old when I walked into a lawyer's conference room and sat down to claim a future that no one, except one man, ever believed I deserved. But to understand what happened that day, you have to go back 15 years. Back to the night I stood outside a friend's house in the dark, holding a single duffel bag, wondering if anyone in the world actually cared whether I lived or died. I was 13 years old, and my own parents had just thrown me out. It wasn't a fight that got out of hand. It wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call. It was a decision. A cold, deliberate choice that my mother and father made the moment they realized I was not going to hand over the one thing I had earned entirely on my own. I had won a prestigious academic scholarship. I had worked for it harder than I had ever worked for anything. And when the letter arrived with my name on it, I felt for the first time in my life like maybe I actually mattered. Like maybe all those hours of studying while the rest of the house went quiet around me had meant something. But my parents looked at that scholarship and saw something else entirely. They saw an opportunity. Not for me, for my older sister. They told me to give it to her.
Just like that.
As if it were a hand-me-down sweater, rather than something I had bled and pushed and sacrificed for. They said her future mattered more. They said she needed it more. And when I looked them in the eyes and said no, when I refused to disappear for someone else's convenience, they decided I was no longer their daughter. They packed my things. They handed me that duffel bag. And they closed the door. I stood outside in the cold with nowhere to go and no one to call. And I remember thinking that this couldn't be real. That parents weren't supposed to do this. That I must have done something terribly wrong, even though deep inside I knew I hadn't done anything wrong at all. And then, without any warning, headlights appeared at the end of the street. My Uncle Harold had driven several hours to find me. I don't even know how he knew where I was. He just showed up, the way he always would, for the next 15 years, without fanfare, without a speech, without asking for anything in return. He simply opened the car door, put my bag in the back, and said, "Let's go home." I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning of everything. Harold Carter was not a flashy man. He didn't make grand promises or speak in inspirational speeches. He was quiet, determined, and absolutely consistent, and in my experience, consistent people are the rarest kind. He gave me a bedroom in his home and told me I never had to earn the right to be there. That sounds simple. But when you've spent your whole childhood being measured and evaluated and found lacking, being told that you simply belong somewhere, no strings, no conditions, that changes something fundamental inside you. He enrolled me in school, showed up to every parent-teacher conference, and made sure I understood that my education was not a luxury or a favor. It was a foundation. And he intended to help me build on it every single day. As the years passed, I graduated near the top of my class. I earned professional certifications. And when the time came, Harold brought me into his company, a real estate empire that stretched across the city, built on decades of discipline and sacrifice and an almost stubborn refusal to cut corners. He didn't hand me a title and a salary and tell me to figure the rest out. He walked me through every part of the business himself. He showed me how to read contracts, how to evaluate an investment before the numbers on the surface told the whole story, how to negotiate a lease without losing either your position or your integrity. And most importantly, he taught me how to stay calm when the people around you are doing everything they can to manufacture chaos. That last lesson I would need more than any other. But I didn't know that yet. Because at this point, I still believed the silence from my parents meant the chapter was closed. 15 years had passed. Not a single phone call. Not one letter. Not even a message sent through someone else. I had built the life without them. A career I was proud of. A sense of self that Harold had helped me construct piece by piece, year by year. And then Harold passed away, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 71, and suddenly, within days of his funeral, my phone began to ring. And the name on the screen was one I hadn't seen in over a decade. My mother. She arrived at Harold's funeral with tears in her eyes and words about family on her lips. After 15 years of silence, she stood beside me at a graveside and spoke about unity and love and how much she had missed me. I won't pretend I didn't feel something. You never fully stop wanting your parents to be the people they were supposed to be. There's a part of you, no matter how old you get, no matter how much you've healed, that still hopes. But hope is not the same as trust. And trust is not the same as amnesia. The messages started coming almost immediately after the service. One after another, carefully written, each one managing to sound warm and reasonable on the surface while quietly steering toward the same destination. My parents began suggesting that because Harold was my father's brother, they had some claim, some right, to be involved in decisions about his estate. They used words like family and fairness and what Harold would have wanted, as if they had any idea what Harold would have wanted from people he had watched abandon his 13-year-old niece without a second thought. What struck me most was not the audacity of the request. It was the order of operations. A genuine attempt at reconciliation begins with accountability. It begins with, "I'm sorry." It begins with an acknowledgement that something was broken and that you were the one who broke it. What I was receiving was not that. It was a negotiation dressed up in the language of love, and I had been trained by one of the best businessmen I'd ever known to recognize the difference. But I didn't respond with anger. I didn't respond with accusations. I waited. Because Harold had left me something before he died, a sealed folder, given to his attorney with specific instructions not to open until after the funeral. And what was inside that folder was about to change everything. Harold's attorney handed me the folder about a week after the service. I sat down alone to open it, and what I found inside wasn't just a letter. It was a record. A detailed, documented account that Harold had kept over the years, because Harold kept records of everything. He had written to me about my father, about the requests for money that had come in over the years, sometimes desperate, sometimes strategic, but almost always accompanied by some mention of me. My name, it turned out, had been used as leverage. Whenever my father needed something from Harold, he found a way to work me into the conversation, as a reason Harold should feel obligated, as a connection that supposedly proved they were still family, as a thread he kept pulling whenever he needed something to hold on to. I read those pages slowly, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not rage, but clarity, because the letters confirmed something I had suspected for years, but never been able to fully name. My parents had never looked at me and seen a daughter they had lost. They had looked at me and seen a door that led to Harold, and to everything Harold had built. I was not a person to be missed. I was a resource to be managed. The reading of the will was scheduled for a few weeks later. By then, I had read every page of that folder more than once. I arrived at the law office early that morning, carrying two things: the folder Harold had left me, and a fountain pen he had given me years earlier. He had pressed it into my hand on the day I signed my first major contract, and told me that a pen like this deserved to be used for things that mattered. I had a feeling today was going to be one of those days. The conference room was full. Business partners, accountants, representatives from charitable organizations Harold had supported for years, longtime tenants, legal professionals. Harold had wanted this done in front of witnesses, not out of drama, but out of principle. He believed that important decisions deserved to be made in the light, with people around who understood the truth of his life and work. My parents arrived just before the meeting began. My mother, my father, and my sister. They moved through the room with a confidence that I imagined took some effort to maintain, greeting people they had never met, introducing themselves as close family, speaking about Harold's legacy in tones that suggested they had been present for the building of it. I watched them from across the room and said nothing. When the attorney called the meeting to order, the room went quiet. The charitable donations were announced first, substantial gifts to organizations that had meant something to Harold. And then the attorney reached the section of the will that everyone was waiting for. He read clearly, "No hesitation, no ambiguity." Harold had named me as the sole heir to his entire estate. Every property, every investment, every asset that made up nearly $24 million of a lifetime's work. And he had named me sole executor, responsible for managing every aspect of the transition. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. But in those seconds, I watched my father's face change completely. He stood up. His voice was loud and certain and completely wrong. He said there must be a mistake. My mother followed, suggesting that Harold had been manipulated in his final months, that someone had taken advantage of a grieving, aging man to redirect his wishes. She said it calmly, as though doubt alone might be enough to unravel something that Harold had spent years carefully building. The attorney let them finish. And then he explained, with the same measured calm he had maintained throughout, that Harold had done everything required to make his wishes legally unassailable. Medical evaluations conducted well before his death. Witness statements. Notarized documents. A paper trail that stretched back not months, but years. There was no ambiguity, no vulnerability, no realistic basis for a challenge. My father sat back down, but the energy in the room had shifted, and I knew that if I didn't speak, the story would be left half-told. So I stood up. I opened the folder. And I started to read, but I didn't read every word. I didn't need to. I read enough. I read the portions of Harold's letter that described my father's requests, the pattern of financial appeals that had arrived over the years, each one threading my name through the conversation like a needle. I explained what those letters revealed, that my parents had not treated my absence as a loss they had caused and carried with them. They had treated it as a tool, something to reference when it was useful, something to set aside when it wasn't. The room grew very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for a speaker to finish. The uncomfortable quiet of people absorbing something they had not expected to hear. One by one, the documents were presented. Letters written in my father's own hand. Requests made across many years. A pattern that no one could mistake for coincidence, because patterns only become visible when you lay them out in order, and Harold, with a patience and precision that had defined his entire life, had laid them out in perfect order. I looked at my parents when I finished, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of someone who has won something. I looked at them the way you look at a problem you have finally, after a very long time, fully understood. I told them that they had not lost me because of bad luck or miscommunication or the kind of ordinary family fracturing that happens to good people. They had made a choice when I was 13 years old. And every year after that, every birthday that passed without a call, every holiday that came and went in silence, they had made that choice again. The consequences they were facing in this room were not something that had been done to them. They were the accumulated result of every choice they had freely made. I signed the estate documents with Harold's pen, and I informed them, quietly and without theater, that any legal challenge would be met through proper channels and that the estate would defend itself as vigorously as necessary. The confidence they had carried into that room when they arrived, the easy smiles, the familiar greetings, the assumption that emotion or pressure or sheer presence could shift an outcome that had already been legally secured, all of it was gone. They finally understood. And understanding, when it arrives that late, is not a gift. It's a reckoning. The months that followed played out almost exactly as Harold had anticipated. My father pursued a legal challenge. It was dismissed by the court without ceremony, for the simple reason that there was no evidence to support it. Only frustration, and the belief that wanting something hard enough should be enough to make it yours. It isn't. Harold had made sure of that. The company continued to grow. The charitable organizations received every contribution Harold had promised them. And I settled into the office that had once been his, surrounded by the records and decisions and principles of a man who had spent 15 years teaching me something that most people never fully learn. Family is not a biological fact. It is not a shared last name or a legal designation or a claim made at a moment of convenience. Family is the person who drives several hours in the middle of the night to pick up a 13-year-old girl standing alone in the dark with a single bag of clothes. Family is the person who gives you a room and asks for nothing in return. Family is the person who teaches you not just how to succeed, but how to stay calm when everything around you is loud and uncertain and determined to shake you loose from what you know to be true. Harold Carter gave me a future when the people who were supposed to love me had decided I wasn't worth one. And because of that, his legacy will never be measured in square footage or property values or dollar amounts. It will be measured in the life he made possible, in the woman he helped me become, and in every person I will carry that lesson forward to that I sit at his desk now. I use his pen, and I never once forget where I came from or the single quiet man who made sure I had somewhere to go.